Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our webinar, How to Apply Scientific Methods to Improve Business Strategies, presented by Ryan Hamilton, Associate Professor of Marketing at Emory University, Goizueta Business School. My name is Rachel Lake, and it will be my pleasure to moderate today's session. Before we get started, I have just a few housekeeping items for our audience. First, all attendees are currently in listen-only mode, which means we can't hear or see you. However, we encourage you to participate in the GoToWebinar control panel. You can submit questions throughout the presentation beneath the corresponding tab, and then we'll do a formal Q&A session at the end. Second, we are recording today's session, and you'll receive a copy of the recording via email in the next day or two. So go ahead and just keep an eye on your inbox. Now that we have those details taken care of, I'd like to introduce today's panelist. Ryan Hamilton is an associate professor of marketing at Emory University's Goizueta Business School. As a consumer psychologist, he investigates shopper decision-making and in particular is interested in how brands, prices, and choice architecture influence decision-making at the point of purchase. His research has been published in some of the top academic journals of marketing and management and has also been featured in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Time, USA Today, CNN Headline News, Reuters, and the Financial Times. It's a pleasure to have you here, Ryan, and I'm excited to get started. I'm going to go ahead and hand the presentation off to you.
Great, thank you so much. Well, I'm very excited to get to share one of my hobby horses. Kind of applying scientific thinking to business has been a topic that I've been very interested in over the last several years, and I'm thrilled to get to share that with you today. So we're going to start off with a marketing problem. So we're going to do a little marketing exercise together. I'm going to show you a product, and I want you to come up with a plan for this product. So here's the product. A Star Trek Enterprise pizza cutter. Sold at $19.99, sold online in various places. So I want you to come up with a plan to increase revenue for this product. Now, this exercise works best if you actually do it. So if you got a pencil in front of you, maybe sketch out what you're going to do, but at least give it some good solid thought. What would you do if you were put in charge of this product? If it helps, this is the NCC 1701 version of the Enterprise. This is from the original, the design from the original 60s TV show. If that matters, if that helps you guide your strategy at all. All right, have you got something? Have you thought about what you would do? How would you increase revenue for this product? Now, when I've done this exercise in class, some typical answers that I get, some students suggest lowering the price to increase sales. Sometimes I'll get students who argue the opposite, that we should raise prices. Sometimes people recommend selling it at conventions or distributing it more widely, maybe through Walmart, or bundling it with some other items. Advertising might help, right? There are some of you listening to me now who are going to go out after this webinar and buy this item, and the only thing that had stopped you before is you didn't know what existed. So that just suggests that maybe advertising might work. So whatever it was that you came up with, hold on to that, because whatever it was that you came up with, we're going to examine it closer. What I want you to examine is not kind of the strength of the strategy you came up with. I want you to think about how you got there. So we have some anticipated outcome that we want. We want to increase sales of this thing or increase revenue. And then from that, we developed some strategy that we thought would lead to that. So let's use decreasing price. That's usually a common one that's brought up when I run this exercise. So you're going to decrease price in order to increase sales, which would lead to increased revenue for the company. Now I want you to go a step further backward. How did you arrive at that strategy? So what led you to the course that you chose, whatever it was, whatever you came up with? And what I'm going to suggest is that there was some theory that underlied the strategy that you chose. In this case, the theory that would lead to the strategy of decreasing price is economics 101, the idea that demand is inversely related to price, and that as you lower the price, then demand goes up. This is a very, very basic idea. So this is that theory. that demand curves slope down, that as you decrease the price, there's going to be more people who would be willing to pay that price, and sales will therefore go up. From that theory, we developed the strategy and then the anticipated outcome. Now, as far as theories go, this is a really good theory. There's a reason that it's taught in your first semester of economics. It's very, very often true. This is a really reliable theory. But even with this theory, which is kind of foundational to most of microeconomics, there are exceptions to it. So there's something called a Veblen good. And the idea of a Veblen good is that part of the value that we get from this good is the fact that it is high priced and therefore exclusive. So a lot of luxury brands are Veblen goods. And if we lower the price, that can actually destroy some of the value. So some recent luxury brands have gotten into trouble from lowering their prices and thereby making the products less desirable and reducing sales over the long run. So maybe that might come into play. Giffen goods are another class of goods where lowering the price can actually lower demand. The story here is that there are some goods where people can only afford to buy so much of them. And in those cases, lowering the price can actually backfire. So one example of a Giffen good, if you can only afford to eat out for lunch a couple of days a week, so most days you pack your lunch, but then every once in a while you go out and buy a burrito from the food cart down the road. If the prices of food staples go up, so if bread and turkey and mayonnaise prices go up, you may now no longer be able to afford going out to eat the occasional burrito. So if the prices of bread goes up, you may actually consume more bread because you can't afford now the alternative. So that's a Giffen good. There are also price quality inferences. So we might assume that the quality of something is related to its price, and that means that by lowering the price, we might lower the perceived quality of the thing and thereby reduce demand for it. So if we've got this theory that's driven our strategy, so we've got this theory that demand is inversely related to price, that as price goes down, demand goes up. Again, that's a really good theory. But even that theory has boundaries on it. There are exceptions. There are places where that theory doesn't hold. This is at the core of what I want to talk to you about today. Every action that we take in business and in life is driven by some theory, whether we've articulated it to ourselves or not. There's some theory that's driving our strategies and our decisions. And then are we articulating that? Are we identifying that? And just as importantly, are we identifying the boundaries around that theory? So this is true not just about price and demand. This is true about any theory. Any theory that we encounter, there are boundaries around it. There are times when it's kind of true or accurate or valid, and there are times when it's not. And one of the things that we overlook when we try to apply science to what we're doing in business is identifying those boundaries and the importance of that. So in other words, when you read about some scientific finding or read some book or newspaper article or magazine article about some new theory that applies to social science, so that applies to marketing or that applies to managing your employees or applies to the financial markets and the way that people behave in those markets, all of those theories have these boundaries around them. So it's not enough to understand the theory. You also need to understand when it applies and when it doesn't, and when a different theory might be better. So let's start off with 3 simple rules for understanding science. I put behavioral science in here because that's my area of expertise, but it applies to all science, but especially to science about people. So when we study people in all their various settings and incarnations, these are 3 rules that we need to worry about when we want to use those insights to improve our decision making, the strategies that we engage in. So the first rule is that there is no theory of human behavior that applies everywhere in all circumstances all the time. So in other words, they all have boundaries around them. The second rule is similar to the first. In fact, it's identical to the first. There is no theory of human behavior that applies to everyone all the time in every circumstance. Rule number 3, by this point you might see coming, there is no theory that applies all the time to everyone in every circumstance. So I'm going to be advocating for science in this presentation. I'm going to be advocating for using scientific insights to improve the way we do business, but we have to do it by understanding the foundational assumptions on which those theories are based. And there's nothing that applies to everyone all the time. So it's not enough to understand the theory, we also need to understand the boundaries. One of the ways that we can understand those boundaries is by looking at where our theories come from. And I've identified 4 different ways that we can generate theories. Going back, I will argue that everything we do is based on some theory of the way the world works, even if we haven't articulated that theory to ourselves. We're constantly making decisions based on theories. When I go and talk to companies, sometimes I'll get this, feedback usually before I give a presentation where they'll suggest, well, tone down the theory talk. Theory is kind of a bad word. People want to know what's practical, want to know what they should do. And I understand the motivation, I really do, but there's no getting away from theories. There's no escaping it. Theories are what drives our decisions. We have to articulate where they come from, and we have to understand how we got there, how we got to those theories. So we're going to go through each of these 4 kind of theory generation methods so we can better know where our theories come from and better recognize the limitations of each of these. Okay? So one way that we can identify theories is through observation. So Darwin developed theories, at least in part, in this way. So he went out into nature, to the Galapagos, to various places around the world, and just saw what he saw and then tried to draw conclusions from that. So he described himself in this way: I am turned into a sort of machine for observing facts and grinding out conclusions, which is a great quote. The problem with this approach, and we're going to identify problems with all of the approaches, but the problem with this approach was identified by this philosopher named Hume. He said, as to past experience, it can be allowed to give direct and certain information of those precise objects only, and that precise period of time which fell under its cognizance. But why this experience should be extended to future times and to other objects, which for aught we know may be only only in appearance similar, that is the main question of which I would insist. Hume, not the most kind of pithy of speakers, but the idea is very important here. What Hume was arguing was, just because we've observed it in the past doesn't mean we're going to observe it in the future. So if you've taken some action in the past and you note that, every time you lower price by 5%, sales go up by 10%. You might draw some kind of theoretical conclusion about why that happens, and therefore expect that it should happen in the future because of that. Now, this is a theory, and it's not a bad way to generate theories, but it is open to this big problem that Hume identified, which is that there's no guarantee that the future is going to be like the past, or that things that we observe in one context will be still hold in another context. So another way of saying this, going back to our kind of diagram of the boundaries between theories, it's possible that we're making our observations in one area and developing a theory, and it may even be a really good theory for that domain. But then what if we're having to apply it in a different situation, right? At some point in the future, or with a different group of customers, or with a different division in a different part of the company? Are we sure that those differences don't matter? That the theory should still apply? Maybe, right? But this is a potential issue, something that we have to worry about. A practical example of this, eBay advertises online kind of by scooping up all possible keyword searches and saying, hey, you can also get that on eBay. So this is the way that they buy their search engine advertising. And some researchers, some economists, were curious as to whether that was effective or how effective it was. And they published a paper, it was a very big deal, this paper, where they went through and they looked at eBay's search engine marketing choices, and then they correlated them with sales and related them back to the investments. And essentially what they came to, the conclusion was eBay was wasting a lot of money. That what eBay did just didn't make sense. They were, they had this controlled experiment. They observed if they cut back on this advertising, what did it do to their sales? And they essentially found that it did nothing to their sales. That they were wasting all this money on the search engine marketing, and it didn't move the needle at all. And they could be saving all this money by just stopping. So this paper was a big deal. And a lot of people who were heavily engaged in search engine marketing took note. And several companies learned from these findings and so dramatically cut back on the search engine marketing that they were doing. They stopped buying keywords and so on. And for a lot of those companies, the outcome was disastrous. So they stopped buying these keywords and sales just cratered. They just went through the floor. I assume people lost their jobs because of this decision that they made. And the issue here is that they were over applying the findings from eBay. So there was this observation that eBay was wasting money by doing this, and the conclusion was therefore, oh, well, we may be wasting our money by doing this too. There's specifics though about the way eBay was enacting this strategy, which didn't apply to a lot of other firms who, took these findings and brought them home. These are some eBay search results from back in the day. Essentially, any words you would buy or any words you would type into your search engine, eBay had bought those and said, you can find these on eBay. Even really ridiculous stuff. In fact, you can find sites where people were kind of deliberately typing in provocative things so they could get those eBay results and screenshot them and turn them into a meme and amuse their friends. So when we're going to apply a theory that's been generated through observation, really important to know, are we dealing with the same kind of basic sets of criteria here? Is it still going to apply for us in our situation? All right, so that's observation. Another way of coming up with theories is deduction. So from deduction, we start with a set of kind of first principles. This is the way the universe works, and from there we logically deduce what must be true from that. So our primary example of a deductive decision maker is Sherlock Holmes. This is a famous Holmes quote: "When you've eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth." If you're remembering back to your the logic class that you took in college, Socratic reasoning, these deductive methods, logical syllogisms, these are all means of deduction and arriving at a conclusion that must be true. So this is a way of developing theory. As you might expect, there are problems with this as well. You can develop good theories this way, right? So it's not that this is fundamentally flawed, but there's a weakness. This weakness was identified by another philosopher, Sir Francis Bacon. From a few examples in particulars, he's referring to the Greeks in this point, flew at once to the most general conclusions, or first principles of science, taking the truths as fixed and immovable. If any new particulars or examples repugnant to their dogmas were mooted or reduced, either they subtly molded them into their systems by distinctions or explanations of their rules, or else coarsely got rid of them by exception. Again, not as pithy as Darwin, but the idea is important. The problem with deduction and what Bacon is arguing here is that there's no re-examination of those first principles from which we logically deduce the theory. In other words, we start with these assumptions and then we deduce the theory, and if ever the theory doesn't work, we kind of attribute it to some other problem other than going back and saying, well, maybe our initial assumptions weren't correct and we should move on from that. This is known as falsification. Are we trying to falsify our theory? Or are we assuming that our theory must be right because it's logically sound, and therefore any problems with it are things that we can just kind of ignore or exempt or assume don't matter, as opposed to trying to improve a theory? Okay. So examples of this, there are lots of them, a lot of them going back a long way. So one example of a deductive theory was what's known as the four humors theory of medicine. So this is very popular in the Middle Ages. And it was deduced from Greek philosophies about the body and about metaphysics. So it was logically deduced that humans have these four different humors, these four different kind of fluids that exist within the body, and it was deduced that if you're sick, it's probably because these humors are out of balance. So this is what led to the idea that people who had fevers should be bled. So they should have leeches applied to them, or they should, you should open a vein. Um, you know, to our modern ears, this sounds like pure insanity, but there was a logic to it, and it could be deduced. Now, the issue with the deductive part of this is that for literally hundreds of years, sick people were bled and then died. And nobody ever went back to say, hey, maybe this assumption about the four humors needing to be in balance, maybe that's not right. Because that was deduced, that was logically proven. And so therefore, the fact that somebody died after we leached them when they were sick wasn't evidence against the theory, because the theory was sound. It had been deduced from truth. Right? So that's the problem there. There are lots of deductive reasoning that we use in business. All of the frameworks that you used in business school are deductive. In other words, they are non-falsifiable. Porter's five forces can't be disproven. It was deduced from logical truths, and therefore it can't ever be adjusted based on what we see on the ground. It has to be kind of reevaluated from a different set of truths. Now, I'm not knocking on frameworks. I'm a business school professor. I teach lots of them. I think they can be very useful in terms of organizing our thinking and identifying flaws or holes in what we're thinking through. We shouldn't make the mistake, though, of thinking that those frameworks are scientific, because they're not. They're not falsifiable, and therefore they produce theories that are not valid scientific theories. All right, so that's another one, deduction. Another way of inducing theories is intuition. We just kind of feel that something is right. So when you're developing a strategy for increasing price, you may just have this kind of gut feeling that this is what we need to do right now. There are people who argue in favor of intuition. In particular, people who observe that the world is getting ever more complicated argue that intuition is becoming increasingly valuable because we're kind of overwhelmed with data. We have these intuitive parts of our brain that are good at processing a lot of data quickly and figuring out what's going on, and then intuitively telling us what to do. The problem with intuition is that our intuitions are empirically, over and over again, just not good. There are narrow cases where intuitions are good. That's when they have been trained on a specific set of problems or decision tasks in an environment where they get accurate feedback quickly. So our intuitions can be trained, and some experts develop good intuitions for that reason, but in general, they're not good. So there are people who have argued the opposite. If you've read Blink, one of the theses of that is that your intuitions are good and you should trust them. The problem with that is if you actually read the book closely, a lot of the examples that are given in Blink kind of argue the opposite of that if you read them closely. So the book opens with this example of these art historians who identify a fraudulent piece of art because it just doesn't feel right. And they can't put their finger on it right away, but they say, yeah, that just intuitively, I don't think that this is real. Later turns out that it was in fact a forgery, and their intuitions were right. But again, we're talking about a very specific class of people. These are our art historians who look at art all the time, and their intuitions have been trained very specifically with a very specific set of tasks with good feedback. So you can trust your intuition in those contexts. If you were to ask me to intuitively evaluate a piece of art, my intuition is useless. Right? So this is a kind of a counter example to the arguments in Blink. This is a different book that kind of looked at a different set of data. One of the arguments for intuition that we hear is that, if you're taking a test, you should always go with your first instinct. And empirically, that's just not good advice. So most students have long believed that you should stick with your first answer and go with your gut. But the data show that when test takers change their answer, they're more than twice as likely to change to an incorrect or to a correct answer rather than an incorrect answer. So, this reevaluation is often better than intuition. So this is a quote that's about economists, but it applies more generally. This economist, J.M. Clark, argues that you know, economists will often focus on the economics, and then they'll kind of intuit the psychological processes of consumers that underlie it. And Clark is arguing that's not a good approach. He says if the economist refuses to be inspired by the psychologist, in other words, if they refuse to like look at the actual research on human psychology, then he'll force himself to make his own psychology, and it will be bad psychology. He's essentially going to substitute in his intuition in place of the research that's been done or the science. And I put my asterisks in here because although this is advice to economists, this is true of anybody. So if we focus just within what we know and then kind of intuit the rest, we're going to be wrong a lot of the time because our intuitions can often be wrong. All right, so the last one we'll talk about is actually a scientific approach from theories, and we should be good here, right? This is what we're supposed to do. This is the holy grail of theory development, is to use science. The problem with science, and it's not a problem with science, it's a problem with how we apply science, which is why you're here to listen to me talk today, is that we kind of treat science inappropriately. We ask more of science than it was designed to do. So there's been this move in behavioral economics, that's kind of the area that I research in, where we can nudge people in all these directions. We can do choice architecture. We can make very small changes and it'll result in big outcomes. So I do research in this area, I do consulting in this area, and I recently had some people who also do consulting in this area kind of come back to me in a panic because of this story. So there was a big behavioral science intervention that looked to get people to take their medicine more regularly. It's a big problem where people don't take all the prescription medicines that they should. And so scientists and doctors have tried to fix this for a long time. Well, some behavioral economists came in and said, well, why don't we have a crack at it? So they essentially ran this intervention where they threw the kitchen sink at the problem. So they took these people who were given this kind of long-term medication like for heart disease or something where you don't see any immediate benefits, but you're supposed to take it very regularly. And they said, well, let's like throw the behavioral economics sink at this problem. Let's do all the things that behavioral science says should influence people's decisions. So it listed here the first part of this article that they had special electronic bottles that could tell when they were being opened. So if you didn't take your pills, then it would send an email to your doctor who could then contact you. They were incentivized by cash rewards and lotteries. So every time you took a pill, you'd get a chance to win. All of these things the science says should work. And they didn't do just one of them, they did all of them. And it didn't work. There was no kind of net increase in people taking their medicine as a result. And this was a big bummer. And it was really kind of existentially threatening to the people who do research in this area and to the people who apply this research, because the conclusion that some people drew from it was behavioral science doesn't work, right? We've been told that it works over and over again. We've been shown these demonstrations, but when we applied to this problem, it didn't work. Therefore, the entire field needs to be called into question, all of these previous findings. Now, we are already smart enough to know, based on what we've talked about so far, that that was a bad conclusion to draw. So essentially, we've got this problem of getting people to change their behavior, and there are all these interventions that were taken, all of which had some scientific backing that suggested they should work, right? And there were then this outcome that where it didn't work. Does that mean that electronic monitoring of bottles would never work, or that that theory was invalid? I suggest that no, but like all theories, there were boundaries around it. Same with lottery payments, right? There's lots of evidence to suggest that that will incentivize people, and social monitoring, letting friends and family know that somebody hasn't been taking their pills so that you can follow up with them. That should also work and will work in certain circumstances. I would argue that the best way to interpret the findings of that study is that the science doesn't work all the time. In other words, this is a generalizability problem, like Hume identified. Whatever was going on with those patients, and I don't know what it is, it was going on outside of the boundaries of these well-established theories, right? We're going back to my 3 rules of applying behavioral science. It's not that any of these theories will work all the time for everyone. They increased the likelihood that it would work by doing all of them at the same time, kind of expanded the boundaries, but that still doesn't mean that it'll apply all the time. This problem of taking pills may be outside of those domains. It may require some other type of intervention, but that doesn't mean that the original science was wrong or inaccurate. This is just something that is true of all science. All right, so we've got these methods for developing theories. You have used some or all of these, even if you didn't realize it. These are how you've developed the theories that led to the strategies that you have used in your business. But all of these have drawbacks. They all have weaknesses that we need to worry about. So the best approach then is to rethink the role of theory in our lives and the way that we appreciate or think about these theories. So this is a quote from a philosopher who's kind of a philosopher of science. He thinks about the way that science should be used. Chalmers said, "A good scientific law or theory is falsifiable just because it makes definite claims about the world." So in other words, what he's saying is if you make a claim, if you make a hypothesis, that hypothesis by its very nature is falsifiable. In other words, it must not be true sometimes in order for it to be a good hypothesis. A very good theory is one that makes wide-ranging claims about the world and which is consequently highly falsifiable. In other words, it's making a lot of specific predictions, any one of which could prove to be not true or accurate. And it is one that resists falsification whenever it's put to the test. So in other words, if we want to have a good theory, we should be actively looking for opportunities to test and see if it's false. Now, theories are never true. This is one big misunderstanding about science. Theories are just making predictions that are waiting to be falsified. This is a really different approach to understanding theories and understanding what we can do with them. A lot of times we treat theories as if they're religions, as if they describe something that's always true and therefore can be trusted all the time. If we go into it knowing that they're never true, no theory has ever been true with a capital T, as in it is always true, then we take a much more conservative approach to applying these theories. Let me give you an example. The greatest counterexample that we can use to theories are never true is, well, what about gravity? Gravity is always true, right? And in point of fact, it's not. It's usually true. There's a reason we still teach it in high school, and that's because it is almost always true, and it is terribly useful, knowing this Newtonian theory of gravity. But Einstein came along and identified boundaries on it. So Newtonian gravity is accurate under most of the cases that we as human beings live. But if you get down to really, really small subatomic level, Newtonian gravity kind of breaks down and it's replaced by another set of forces. If we talk about some things that are really, really big, like planetary level, then Newtonian gravity doesn't explain everything that's going on. So we need new theories to explain those cases. This is always the way it is. Always. Any theory, we need to know what those boundaries are and know that maybe there's a better theory that needs to apply in this other domain over here. So if we want to think like a scientist, if we want to apply these scientific insights and really kind of know what's going on, then we have to identify this process. We have to articulate our theories and know what they are, but then we need to add some additional steps. So when we turn to science, we are looking for solutions. And that's just not the way science operates. It's not what it was designed to do. And when we try to look to science for solutions, we are breaking kind of the fundamental rules of science. So instead of solutions, we should look to science for hypotheses, for better theories. We then take those better theories and develop hypotheses. And that means that we don't jump straight from a theory to a strategy, straight to a solution. We instead recognize, well, this theory suggests that this might be true. Now, are we in the circumstances where that is going to hold, where that is going to be true? Is it going to be true for us? It worked for eBay, but are we enough like eBay that it's also going to be true for us? That's a hypothesis. And hypotheses aren't truths, they're things to be tested. So we test them. Now, testing doesn't happen by accident. A lot of times we kind of assume that by taking some action, we'll be able to look back and know whether it was successful or not. And there are times when that happens. There are times when we, increased advertising by 20% and suddenly sales quadrupled and went through the roof, and it happened immediately. And so we've got some pretty good idea that yes, A caused B. The reality is that most of the time, unless we set it up beforehand to test it very, very rigorously, we're going to end up in this gray area where, yeah, we did this thing and sales went up, but sales went up for some of our competitors too, and it could have also been because we changed our distribution at the same time. The world is a really messy place, and so unless we set it up beforehand to do something like a controlled experiment where we can actually test the outcome and see and know for sure, or as close to for sure as we can, then it's not always obvious that that hypothesis is just naturally going to be tested. So we need to generate hypotheses, we need to test those hypotheses, and then we need to go back and refine our theories accordingly. So the reason that we test these hypotheses is so that we can feed back into our theories and refine our theories. Our theories should never be precious to us. This is hard. As human beings, we like to stake a claim and say, this is what I believe. But the scientific method requires that we update our theories based on the evidence. And even if something is generally true, it just might not be true for us. So can we develop a more accurate theory based on the situations that we're in and constantly be looking to refine that? And if this diagram looks at all familiar, that's because you learned it in third grade. This is the scientific method. And it is not the business method. It's not what we do in business. We demand solutions and we demand to jump straight to them. And as a result, we don't learn as much as we should and as much as we could. And this is a missed opportunity for all of us. So let me close out here by talking through a metaphor that I hope will kind of tie this together, and then giving you some kind of takeaways, and then we'll do some Q&A. So the metaphor that I use for this is the drug approval process in the United States. So if you want to get a drug approved to send it out on the market, there are a bunch of steps that are mandated by the government that you have to go through. So you do some lab research. This gets you some ideas of what's kind of going on initially. You then move on to animal trials where you test to see if it will shrink tumors in rats. And then you move on to clinical trials. Now, interesting, clinical trials, phase 1 clinical trials, doesn't even test to see if it's efficacious. It doesn't test to see if it combats the disease. It tests exclusively for side effects. So yeah, this thing might cure cancer, but it also kills off your kidneys at the same time. That's no good. Phase 2 clinical trials, now we're actually seeing if it will help address the disease itself. And we're dealing now with kind of, titration levels, how much of this drug should we give, and on what schedule, and all of those kinds of things. We then move on to larger phase clinical trials, where we're testing it now with more people, more variability in the sample. Finally, the drug goes to market, and people can actually start getting it from their doctor, but we're not even done then. Now we have to test what's going on afterwards. Now we've got a much larger sample, and really, really low probability events might start to crop up. So if this thing, causes serious problems in a very small but significant portion of the people who take it, that might not appear until this final phase. Let's compare this process to social science and the insights that a lot of us read in these business books and in, scientific reporting articles in the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. The process looks something like this. So the research that we do, that I do, that people like me do, I would characterize as being kind of roughly equivalent to lab tests in animal trials, right? Where we're looking at data from one company so that we can run our sophisticated models on it, or we're running controlled experiments on small groups of people, sometimes on college students, and this allows us to develop theories, and those can be valid theories, and they can be important theories in helping us understand people. But you want to apply those theories. You want to actually solve problems with them. And so there are all of these intermediate steps that never happen. Nobody's doing that work. I don't do that work as a research scientist. I'm not rewarded for it. If I were to publish, try to publish something that was research roughly equivalent to a clinical trial where I say, well, yeah, this theory holds, but just how much of it holds and in which circumstances, and is it true for aerospace industry just like it is true for pharmaceuticals or telecoms? That research is essentially unpublishable in academic journals, and so it would be detrimental to my career to try. So nobody's doing this. What that means is that if you want to apply the science, you need to do this. You need to worry about, are there blowback effects? So yes, this theory might improve sales in this particular way, but in the context of doing that, it's going to totally erode the trust in our brand, and therefore over the long term will destroy the value that the company provides. You need to figure that out because nobody else is doing it for you. All right, so the takeaways, what you can do today to solve this problem. I've got a couple of things. First, articulate your theories. Where are those theories coming from? You have them, they drive your decision making, but unless you observe them and figure out what they are, they're just running in the background, and you will never improve them if you don't. So that's the first step. What are your theories? Every time you make a decision, ask yourself, what am I assuming? What has to be true in order for this to turn out? Recognize that whatever the source of your theory, there are some pretty stable inherent weaknesses to those that we articulated, right? So is it a theory of generalizability? Is it a theory of falsifiability? What are the weaknesses of the theories based on how you came up with them? Two, make hypotheses, not predictions. So don't jump straight to solutions. Don't jump straight to what you are sure will happen. Make a formal hypothesis. If this is true, then this should be the outcome. We learn from hypotheses in ways that we don't learn from predictions and that we don't learn from solutions. So make that your goal. Generate a hypothesis. Whenever possible, turn acting into testing. So think beforehand. How are we going to test this? How are we going to know if this is true? Is there an opportunity for a control condition? Can we randomly assign this to different populations and then rigorously test? Good testing hardly ever happens by accident. It usually requires a lot of planning in order for it to work well. And then finally, foster a culture of experimentation. Primary among among the characteristics of a good culture of experimentation is freedom to be wrong. So if we make a hypothesis, hypotheses are intended to be falsified. We are looking for evidence that the hypothesis is not true. That is totally different from the mindset of making a prediction, where the person who made a prediction now has skin in that game and now needs it to be true because that's how he or she is going to be evaluated. So are we fostering this ability that we know that not everybody knows everything? We know that not all true and valid theories are true and valid all the time. Is there the opportunity to be wrong in such a way that we've learned from it? And are people rewarded for that? I'll end with a couple of quotes. Richard Feynman is a Nobel Prize winning physicist. Science is the belief in the ignorance of experts. Again, this is different from the way we approach business, where we expect that experts have all the answers. Here, Richard Feynman's one of the smartest people who's ever lived. And this is him admitting, we don't know everything. Nobody does. Are we acknowledging that and building off of it instead of closing our eyes and pretending that it's not true? And then Neil deGrasse Tyson, science isn't for people who love answers. Science is for people who love questions. Religion is for people who love answers. I know that we need answers. I know that we need to enact strategies. We need to make decisions. But when we demand that of science, we are turning science into a religion. We're turning it into something that it was not meant to be, and we're robbing it of its power, and we end up fooling ourselves. So that is it for my prepared remarks. I'm very happy to do my best to answer any questions that you have, and thank you kindly for listening. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Ryan. That was really informative. We do have some questions from the audience today.
Great.
So I'm going to start off with if you have multiple hypotheses after coming up with a theory, how would you determine which hypotheses to test first? So how would you kind of prioritize what gets tested first?
That is a great question. So first of all, if you've come up with multiple hypotheses, you're doing it right. That is evidence that you were thinking about this thoroughly and really thinking about it. So without getting too much into the weeds on this, if I were given that task, that approach, I would look at where are those hypotheses coming from. So are these hypotheses multiple hypotheses that are generated from the same theory? In that case, you might be able to get away with testing few of them if your goal is to really, test if this theory is true or not. Then maybe look for the most falsifiable of them. Sometimes, though, we have competing hypotheses. So theory A would say this, theory B would say that. So going back to the pizza cutter at the beginning, I will sometimes have students say we should lower price because that will increase demand and increase sales and then therefore increase revenue. Sometimes I'll have students who say we should raise price because that will then increase the revenue that we generate per sale. Those are both based on valid theories, right? So the raising price assumes that there's very low levels of price elasticity, that people are insensitive to price changes. Both of those are valid theories. We just want to know which one applies here. So can we set up a test in order to test multiple hypotheses at the same time? So in other words, could we randomly divide our market into 3 different groups, one region or one set of stores or one, 1/3 of the people who come to our website are going to see it at a higher price, 1/3 are going to see it at a lower price, and 1/3 are going to see it at the current price. And then that way we can test and see, all right, across these different hypotheses, is one better supported than others? So in terms of like kind of prioritizing hypotheses, which one would be the most informative if it turned out to be falsified? Which theory do you think is the most applicable? So, we know that we can't always be right, but, based on what we do know about this theory, what are the assumptions that underlie it? And it seems like most of the assumptions fit better for this theory than this theory. Therefore, it might be more important for us to test this one than that one, that kind of thing. So yeah, prioritize based on what you can learn out of them.
Okay, thanks. That was really helpful. So the next question is, do you have any recommendations for selecting like an appropriate sample size for hypothesis testing?
Mm. Yes, and there's lots of good science on this. So, I'm not a statistician. I'm married to one, so I can kind of speak the language sometimes. But there's a lot of great statistical research that's been done on the sizes of the sample that you need. When you're one quick aside on sample size, there are 2 statistical ways that you need to worry about sample size. So one is when you're drawing a conclusion about a population. So when you're surveying a population, then you need a sample size that's sufficient to reduce that margin of uncertainty around your results, so that you can say, yes, this sample is representative of the larger population, and I can feel confident about that. So a lot of marketing research that you do uses that kind of sample size methodology. When you're running a controlled experiment, usually you need a smaller sample size to do that, because now you're not trying to say, the willingness to pay of this whole market is X. Now you're primarily concerned with, is one of these groups different than the other? And so that kind of test requires less statistical power than this test about drawing an inference about a population as a whole. I'm not going to give you a number because there's no answer to that without knowing more about what you're trying to test and kind of the size of the effect that you're looking for and that kind of thing. Real rough rules of thumb that that researchers like me will use is, a lot of times if we are testing something where we expect there'll be a reasonably large effect size in a reasonably controlled population or setting. So in other words, there'll be less statistical noise in there. Usually we're looking for samples of at least 50 people per kind of condition per cell. But the more that you can get, the better. So the more people you have in your samples, the more reliable your results will be. If it's ever kind of dropping below some of those numbers, you need to really start to be very cautious in the way that you analyze the data.
Okay, thank you. So the next question is, for a problem that involves consumer behavior, it's almost impossible to control every outside condition. What do you recommend for kind of measuring results that are as accurate as possible?
Yeah, believe me, I know. This is what I do in my day job. Yeah, no, it's a very good question. So when you're testing theory, um, the most important thing that you want to do is control as much as possible so that you can test those hypotheses. Uh, if you don't control a lot, then you're going to introduce a lot of noise into the data, and that can make it hard to detect what you're looking for. Um, Usually, when you are testing something for a firm, you're not just testing to see if the theory is true. You also want to know, is it going to be true kind of in our settings? And so, or with a large enough group of people. And so in those settings, you may actually benefit from having kind of more noise in your sample. So like let me see if I can articulate this in a different way. So when I, as a research scientist, am trying to test a theory, um, it can be an acceptable result to me to have a very small effect, as long as it's reliable and tells me something about the way people make decisions, for example. If you are interested in, you know, selling more of those pizza cutters, a very small, reliable effect that's reliably kind of swamped by everything else that's going on in the marketplace is not as useful for you. So my advice would be to test things as close to the ground as you can. So as close to real uh, choice settings that your customers are going to be in. And so field tests will tend to be more valuable for you than a more controlled, like hypothetical situation that you might run online. If I'm testing a theory in general, I may be very comfortable with testing it just on college students or just with an online sample where I give them a vignette. Like imagine you were buying a TV. For me, that may be perfectly fine for testing the theory. For you, wanting to apply the theory, wanting to identify whether you're within those boundary conditions, you want to get as close to the actual setting as possible, recognizing that means you're going to be controlling for less of what's going on. But because your ultimate goal is increasing sales for this product right now in these regions, testing it with a different product in different regions with different sets of customers might still be a valid way to test the theory, but probably isn't the question that you want to answer. So my advice is accept the lack of control, because that may result in results that are going to be more useful for you, even if they're not the best way to test the theory. That's my job. Your job should be focused on the application, which means kind of closer to the ground and accepting more noise and looking for those biggest effects that you can find.
Great, thank you. So I think we have time, if it's okay with you, for one or two more questions.
Sure.
Okay, great. Um, can you please speak to the fail fast
Yeah.
methodology and culture into your processes?
Yes. Um, so fail fast is a way of testing things on the fly. So the idea is that if you're, particularly if you're innovating, if you're developing a new product, or if you're launching a new company, a lot of times that's a big gamble. So we're gonna introduce this new product, or we're gonna start this new company, and then we're gonna make all these decisions along this process, and then we're gonna release it out to the marketplace, and we sure hope it sells. And if it sells, we're successful, and if it doesn't, then the company folds, or that division is done away with. The fail fast model comes out of Silicon Valley and a lot of tech firms, where they say, instead of like making one big bet, can we make a bunch of smaller bets that are along this process that allow us to learn along the way? So we're going to prototype a lot, and then we're going to like market test those things in very small ways, so that the costs of being wrong are smaller, and we have more opportunities to learn, instead of just having one theory that we kind of don't test until the end when we release it out into the wild. Let's test our theory along the way and refine. I'm a big fan of the fail-fast model. A/B testing fits into that. The idea, though, is that we're going to A/B test or test along the way. Sometimes it's called a stage gate model, where we're going to interrupt our process with these stage gates, and we have to like actually go out and test before we can move on to the next phase. I'm a big fan of all of these in terms of their approaches. The one thing I would add is it's possible to fail fast and to stage gate without an eye towards theory. So it's possible to just kind of learn and adjust on the fly without taking a larger step back and saying, what have we learned in total from these insights? And the advantage of doing that is that hopefully then that will improve your hypotheses for each new step of the way, right? We should never feel that we're confident. We should never feel like we've learned everything. Still going to be a good idea to test it, but hopefully it'll make our subsequent tests more efficient as we refine our theory and we get a better idea of what our customers or our employees or however we're going to apply this, kind of what's going on in their heads and anticipating better.
Okay, thank you. So the last question, how do you communicate the value of testing to a superior at work or an outside client, especially when the testing costs time and resources?
Yeah, a really, really good question. That, I framed the last piece of advice that I gave in terms of a cultural issue because that's how I view it. It requires a cultural change. Managers are very often outcome focused. Did what the actions that you take increase sales or not? Did the actions that you took, decrease turnover or not, or improve the bottom line or not? And we can all understand the intuitive appeal of that. A culture of experimentation requires a change from that. It's not that we don't care about outcomes anymore. We do, but it requires a change to focusing on the process. So did we engage in this process in such a way that it produced an outcome that we learned from, even if it wasn't successful? Obviously, we want successful outcomes, and this process improves the likelihood of that happening. But if we can evaluate, Harrah's Casino, there's a quote there that there's only a few things that'll get you fired for sure from Harrah's Casino. Harassing employees, embezzling from the company, and failing to have a control condition when you take some action, right? So they've tried to incorporate this culturally within their business, and it requires, reevaluating the way that we evaluate our actions and evaluate our employees. The shortest answer I can give to that question is the alternative to testing is not testing. So, testing is expensive. It can be, and it can slow us down. It can require time. Like I get it. I completely understand that. But the alternative to it is just not knowing usually, right? Usually our outcomes are in this gray area where maybe it improved things, maybe it did nothing, maybe it didn't improve things. And unless we test it, we don't know. And so we may continue doing something that is actually kind of mildly detrimental to the company and just won't show up for 5 years because we haven't implemented a program to know what it's doing. Sometimes it may never show up. So that's the best argument I can give. Like, choosing not to test means that we are hoping for that minority of outcomes where things just really take off or really crater immediately and we can know. And that means that we're leaving, maybe 80% of the outcomes in this gray area where we don't know afterwards. And how can we possibly be better off as a business not knowing rather than knowing?
That was a great point to end on. Thank you so much, Ryan. This was really informative, and I super appreciate your time and your insight. Before we draw things to a close, do you have any comments that you'd like to end on?
Um, Actually, the one that we ended on was the one that I had hoped that we would get to. It is not easy. It's counterintuitive. We as human beings like outcomes. We like our lay unobserved theories, right? We have these core beliefs about the way people work and the way markets work, and we kind of don't want them disrupted. It can be disturbing. to have those core beliefs be disrupted. Uh, but we've got now hundreds of years of evidence suggesting that a scientific approach, the scientific method, produces better outcomes in the long run. And so I would argue it's worth those kind of cultural pains to try to do it. And if you're not in a position to do it now, someday you will be. And so, do what you can around the margins with the eye towards improving the long-term success of whatever business you're in by implementing these cultural changes and looking at things in a different way.
Okay, well, wonderful. Thank you again, Ryan, and thank you to everyone who watched the presentation today and submitted questions. Just as a reminder, I will be sending an email in the next day or so with a link to a recording of today's webinar. And thank you for joining us. I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody.